Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Do you want to start that again?
Sure.
Okay. Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast.
Woohoo!
We have a very, very, very special episode for you to start off 2018. This is our first podcast of our third year of doing this. We started in 2016 last year. Here we are in 2018. And
Amazing.
to start us off, we're actually going to present the first inaugural, I guess that's an oxymoron, the inaugural Imaginary Awards. This is the first time that we're doing this. We're giving awards to all of the best books, novels, novellas, comics, movies, TV shows, moments on screen of last year. Yes. So,
Yes.
we have a lot to do. It's going to be really awesome. This is going to be basically, if you are looking back at last year and thinking there was a lot to see, there was a lot to read, there was a lot to just potentially invest your time in.
You were not wrong.
You were not wrong. Well, right. Number one, you were not wrong. But hopefully, this will be our guide to you to help you discover some of the things that we particularly liked last year. Because 2017 had a lot of things, but it had a lot of good things. There was a lot of excellent writing, excellent on-screen adventures that came out last year. So, let's do it.
Let's do this. I am personally very, very excited. If we haven't already covered this, my name is Ken, and my fellow podcaster here is Tony.
Hello.
And we come from very different backgrounds. We have very different taste in books, and some of our discussions about what should be our top pick for the year ended up being stalemate. So just so you know, it is okay to disagree with us in our picks, because we disagree with us and our picks sometimes. What we are doing here is we are pointing out, generally speaking, our top picks for the year. We will each also talk about some of our personal picks, which we did not collectively choose as our collective best pick. So we are going to start at the top with traditional long-form novels.
Before we jump into it, you can check out all of these nominees and winners by the time this podcast goes up on our website, imaginaries.net. Go to the new link that says the Imaginary Awards. You'll be presented with all of our nominees, our new winners, and then at the bottom of the page, all of the books, both novels and novellas, the TV shows, the movies, everything we consumed from 2017 to try and bring you the best of the year. So go check that out. They're very long lists there. So that's everything we're going to be drawing from.
Yes, you will be able to see all of our various lists. Every item on our list is individually great. And we are not here to talk about our reasons for not picking books for our lists. We are here to talk about what we loved best about 2017. And yes, there were some fails, but we're not going to talk about those here today. We are talking just about things that we definitely want everyone to read that came out last year.
Yes,
or
definitely.
watch, or whatever.
Yeah. Right. So
long-form novels.
Long-form novels. So our nominees, our 2017 nominees for Best Novel are...
and we're going in alphabetical order here. So, Naomi Alderman's The Power.
Right. Daughter of Eden by Chris Beckett.
Star's End by Cassandra Rose Clark.
American War by Omar El-Akkad.
Wintertide by Ruthana Emrys.
Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich.
Terminal Alliance by Jim Hines.
The Wanderers by Meg Howry.
The Stars Are Legion by Cameron Hurley.
The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin.
The Moon and the Other by John Kessel.
Luna Wolf Moon by Ian MacDonald.
Autonomous by Annalee Newitt.
Akata Warrior by Nettie Okorafor.
La Belle Sauvage by Philip Pullman.
Revenger by Alistair Reynolds.
Sourdough by Robin Sloan.
And last, but only because it's alphabetically last, Born by Jeff Vandermeer.
And Tony, would you go ahead and name one of our top picks?
I absolutely will. So
best novel.
We actually had a tie because we had so many that we liked this year, we couldn't pick just one of the novels of our nominees.
We cheated.
Yeah, we cheated. So we chose two, a tie between two novels for Best of 2017. One of those novels is first-time novel writer Omar El Akkad's American War. Yay!
And our other one is Naomi Alderman's The Power.
Yay.
So, Tony, can you tell me why American War won Best Novel #1?
So, we have two books for Best Novel. American War and The Power. The Power we haven't talked about at all on this podcast, but American War we actually really, really loved back in our...
Yeah, we had a full podcast
what
it.
Was the name of that podcast? I don't even remember. War, what is it good for? So we framed our conversation about war in science fiction with Omar El Akkad's American War, which we really loved, and then we found a way to talk more largely about war. But what this book does, the realistically bleak future that it paints, the way that it draws its characters, just the stunning amount of work that clearly went into this book, and the good writer that Omar El Akkad is, just
beautiful writing.
Everything about this book just sort of screamed, I am one of the best. And so when we were going down this list and thinking about, what were the best books of the year, what are the books we're going to remember, what are the books that really had the most impact on us as readers, as writers, that we hope will have the most impact on other writers as we're, picking up material in subsequent years, this was a clear standout for both of us.
It was. And it says something really special about a book that we read this relatively early in the year.
Yes.
And we both still felt emerging at the end of the year that it was a defining moment for us.
Yes.
And if a book can hold up for a whole year without you forgetting what happened or what you loved about it, then that's a really good sign. And I would contrast that to our best novel pick, #2, which is Naomi Alderman's The Power, which... for both of us came relatively late in the year. And it came out earlier in the year, but we weren't able to get it at our various libraries until the very end of the year, at least in my case. Yeah. And so that was a great 1-2 punch. We bookended the year with these books. And I couldn't imagine a better way to journey through 2017 than with both of these near future sort of post-disaster. Yeah. Only it's not really. I don't know. They're complicated. And American War uses a slightly less MacGuffinish MacGuffin to get us into the plot. The Power uses something a little bit more MacGuffin-y, but they're both near future. They're both examining issues of gender, race, and identity in ways that are really rich and rewarding. And they're also both dealing with war. Yes. And they're both dealing with the complicated nature of being raised in a world of war. Yes. And I love them so much. They were both my top picks. Yes. And I'm so glad that we picked them both.
I think both of these books for me are excellent answers to folks who might ask the question, well, what is the power of science fiction? Why read fantasy? Why are you spending time on speculative fiction?
Sure.
Both American War and The Power answer that so powerfully that, if you're looking for not only go to really, really excellent books, but also books that you can hand to folks who don't necessarily read science fiction, fantasy, anything along that sort of speculative spectrum, they are that good. They have really cross-genre appeal, I think. So
yeah, and really strong sentences. Yeah. I would say both books, on a language level, had so much going for them that even if they'd been about topping, which I don't really enjoy, or something else which I don't really enjoy, like enemas, I probably still would have read these books and enjoyed them.
Yes.
You know, the language was so rich.
Yes.
So those are our top picks for best novel, but we had some other recommendations we wanted to throw out here on the line, just so you guys know we are widely read. You know, we didn't just pick these out of a hat and say these are the only books we're reading this year.
Right.
So, Tony, do you want to briefly tell us about one of your talk about
Yes,
picks
absolutely. So, when I picked up Autonomous by Anne Lee Newitz, I knew based on the cover that there was going to be something really interesting in there. And I will say also that I came to it in this kind of resistant way, because I kept seeing it being talked up on Twitter as something like robots and pirates, or pirates meet robots or something. And I was like, that sounds terrible. And I mean that in, like, you know, a way that kind of suspends judgment, but also to show you how far I came, because it ended up being one of my very favorite books of the year. Like, again, really that, you know, heavily researched, but entirely readable, with excellent writing, just the most pleasurable hodgepodge of things are going on in this book, and I could totally see it, you know, like, winning not only our awards, or the award in my heart, but also, like, you know, I think this is the book with the staying power of books that have launched subgenres in science fiction before. I know it was getting a lot of comparison to, or there were a lot of comparisons being made to Neuromancer, and how that really kind of jump-started cyberpunk, or, you know, and how they're, you know, based on Autonomous, how there could be, you know, this whole new direction for science fiction. And that would be really cool, and we could talk more about that at another time. But
absolutely.
Autonomous by Anne Lee Newitz, very, very high on my list of best books for the year.
Yeah, and I also read it, and I also recommend it. I think it did some very interesting things with the exploration of gender and the intersection of gender and artificial intelligence. And I think that there's no easy way of transitioning to one of my talk about picks from there, but I would kind of full circle back to this American War, the power combination, in that a lot of my top picks for this year had traction not just in the, like, I only love science fiction category of readers. They also had a lot of traction in the quote-unquote airy, snotty literary fiction quarters, of which I also count myself one of those people. So I am both a snotty literary genre person. I am also a science fiction, like, totally trashy science fiction reader. So The Power and American War were great, obviously. But I also had Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God on my talk about list. She also released this rather late in the year, but I'm still chewing through it and thinking about it a great deal. Louise Erdrich does not generally write science fiction. She generally writes hard-hitting fiction, just like straight-up fiction. Sometimes it's historical. It's all informed by her identity as an Ojibwa woman. So she writes about the intersection of near-future dystopia with the female body, with indigenous identity. And it's incredible. Like, I don't know quite like what to do with myself after reading a book like The Future Home of the Living God, because every bit of it was unexpected for me. Again, it has kind of a significant MacGuffin that you have to make your peace with before you get started. But again, really beautiful sentences, really important work done on the page for representation, and just, like, generally doing justice to underrepresented communities in a way that I haven't seen in science fiction a whole lot, but we're starting to see a little bit more, and that's just really pleasurable and awesome. And if you've steered clear of this because you know Louise Erdrich's back publications and they're not your thing, don't bring that judgment to this book. It's radically different from everything she's done. I really respect the work. What's your next talk about pick?
So this year was also a really good year for forward-thinking space operas. We'll talk about several of them. We had multiple ones on our nomination list, including, depending upon how you define space opera, The Stars Are Legion by Cameron Hurley, The Moon and the Other by John Kessel, Luna Wolf Moon by Ian MacDonald, Revenger by Alistair Reynolds, and Terminal Alliance by Jim Hines. I wanted to talk really briefly about Revenger by Alistair Reynolds and Terminal Alliance by Jim Hines. I chose both of those because they push what should be a known quantity, the space opera. You have grand themes of good and evil and many others, and you splash them across the galaxy with alien races and artificial intelligences and faster than light travel, whether it's hard science fiction or not, because maybe it's not faster than light. But anyway, these are known things. And if you pick up, rando book of science fiction where the name of the author is in big letters on the front and it's a hardback and it might even say New York Times bestseller, probably it's going to be something that is space operatic, or like those have been space operas in the past. And so to find space operas, as we did this year, and we found several of them, that really help to rethink and redefine what's going on there is so pleasurable. And both of these books did it so well, but did it in really different ways. And I was really hard-pressed to choose, which one do I talk about, one over the other. So, with our top novel of the year, I chose both. Terminal Alliance, definitely, if you're into the more tongue-in-cheek, wink-wink science fiction. If you've read any of Becky Chambers' books, Terminal Alliance is going to be right up your alley.
Right.
Whereas Revenger, and Terminal Alliance, I should say, it has really funny moments. Overall, it's a really rollicking, jolly little ride. But it's also very serious. Revenger has a lot more of the seriousness going on. You get a peek at this universe, which Alistair Reynolds has filled with so much, joyous detail. I've been reading, based on this book, I've been going back and reading some of his others. And if you're a fan of Alistair Reynolds, if you're a fan of the intensely detailed, intensely thought out universes that he creates, it's on display in Revenger as well, but elevated. You can tell that he's pushing himself, challenging himself, constantly reinventing the way that he does it. So, two really wonderful space operas for this year. Terminal Alliance, Revenger. If you're into space opera, definitely, give yourself the treat of checking them out.
I definitely agree. And in fact, I actually purchased Terminal Alliance, and it's very rare for me to purchase a space opera. Mm-hmm. So I think they're both very strong showings, and they also plant the seeds for several different directions that space operas can go in the future.
Yes.
I think that they're just very, very pleasurable reads, and every science fiction awards should feature pleasurable reads.
Yes, absolutely.
Which takes me to my next talk about pick, which was just a sheer delight, I can't wait to talk more about it. And for those of you guys who have not read this book, you do not know what you are missing out on. It is just amazing. So the book I am thinking of is Sourdough, and this book is by Robin Sloan. And so this book mashes up artificial intelligence, I guess you could say farmer's market culture.
Yes, you absolutely could say that. The science of baking. Underground, pseudo-military, laboratory experiment context. Yeah. And the city of Science Frisco. I am not good on words right now, let's just say that. But this book, San Francisco, features heavily. This is a book in which a lot of really weird work is done, but the language doesn't strike you at first glance as typical weird science fiction language, which we've talked about weird science fiction at length very recently, and that was a lot of fun. I wish I had read this book before we had recorded that episode, because it is clearly weird sci-fi, but it is so different from books like those written by Jeff Vandermeer, for example. Yes. They just operate on different levels, but
as a person who has only had drive-by experience with San Francisco, I probably am not the most expert reader in terms of interpreting or commenting upon the San Francisco-ness of this book, but the farmers market culture mixed with baking, mixed with underground laboratory artificial intelligence is just, it's light, it's funny, but it has a real heart to it. And the stakes eventually become very, very real indeed.
Yeah.
And I devoured this book in an evening, which, when I'm sleep deprived, says quite a lot about the quality of the work. So that is a book which made it onto my top list for sure. And I mean, I can't wait to see what comes next from this particular author. So, yeah. Highly recommend. So, Tony, do you have any more talk about?
I do. I have one more, and it is, drumroll please, Philip Pullman's La Belle Sauvage, the first in the new Book of Dust trilogy. And I mentioned this in part because, or I chose this in part because my expectations were so high for this book. And because I think that's a really hard thing to do, right? When you rate something that is so good and so well received, not only, you know, I assume, and I'm assuming on the part of Philip Pullman here, but like, by all accounts, he was very pleased with his Dark Materials, that trilogy that started with Northern Lights or The Golden Compass, depending upon your region. And so to return to that after literally decades, obviously, expectations would be high. A lot of things have changed in that time. You know, when you're looking at something, obviously, as a reader, you don't want the same thing, even though you want to return to the world. You don't want something that immediately picks up exactly where the last thing left off. Things have changed in the interim. You've changed. The way you read has changed. The books you read have changed. So, somehow, through some alchemical process, Philip Pullman has managed to create the first volume of a sequel trilogy, and we'll see if he keeps it up, but based on this, I bet he will.
Prequel.
That is simultaneously really satisfyingly in the same world as his Dark Materials, specifically The Golden Compass, but also takes the themes of that, hits hard on them, explores them more, updates them, so a modern reader isn't thinking like, oh, this is what Philip Pullman was thinking 20 years ago, but rather like, this is utterly engaged with what I'm thinking now and what's going on now. So just the sheer perfection that is managing to get that out and have it be a work that works both as a sequel, a prequel, and an update is, you know, I was so impressed. I didn't read this quite in one day, like you read Sourdough, but I read it in 2, so that kept me going.
I really enjoyed how deeply informed it is by The Fairy Queen by Spencer. It was a very different flavor from what I was both expecting and from the original, but I happen to think that it's pretty magical when you met a series as a young person and it changed your life and how you read, and then you encounter another book by the same author as an adult, and it still reaches you where you're at then. I know not everyone had the same experience with La Belle Sauvage, and I respect other people having different encounters with this book, but I happen to think, at least as far as I'm concerned, and I believe as far as you are concerned, that it's really, it's so unusual to find an author who speaks to you strongly at 2 very different times of your life. And I really respect what Pullman did there. So I see you, Philip Pullman. I respect you a great deal. And my final talk about pick for this particular category, I'm actually not going to belabor the point too much because I feel like many, many other people have written elegant and insightful reviews about Meg Howry's The Wanderers, but like my other top picks, this is in conversation with that near future interrogation of identity and gender and bodies and space. And it's also really pleasurable for me because it it intersects nicely with the rising drama of SpaceX. Like, it's very clearly going at SpaceX, and I appreciated that. And I also appreciated that all of the characters felt fully realized and rounded. And that there wasn't just some toss out sort of catering to the queer community. There were real and legitimate queer characters struggling with their queerness in this book. And I also really appreciated this conversation that Meg Howry raised about how we build public identities for ourselves that contrast with our private internal identities. And how at some point you're going to become very, very confused if those two do not align. And so, another very strong darling of both literary and science fiction communities. And that rounds out our top picks and our best books for novels of 2017. Great work, everyone.
Great
work, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, really, I say that kind of, blithely, but really, this was all in 2017, and the fact that we had, just this amazing crop of books. I am just so both pleased and humbled to, and that sounds almost weird to say, doesn't it? But to be someone who is of this moment and taking part in this moment and trying to get others to take part in this moment, hence why we're podcasting. These are some really, really, really good books. Really
good books. I feel like, why would we ever spend significant time tearing down books we didn't like when we have such a thick crop of winners? And so that is what I am dedicated to from here on out. I just love so many books. And there's so many good books out there to love that I feel like I could just be positive all the time, and wouldn't that be nice? So next category, don't go anywhere because we have some really good picks in this category too. So the next category we're going to talk about is novellas.
So our 2017 nominees for best novella are, so we're going to start off again alphabetically. So Landscape with Invisible Hand by M.T. Anderson.
River of Teeth by Sarah Gailey.
Taste of Marrow by Sarah Gailey.
And The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion by Margaret Killjoy.
Passing Strange by Ellen Klages.
Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shannon McGuire.
Binti Home by Nydia Okorafor.
Ironclads by Adrienne Tchaikovsky.
All Systems Red by Martha Wells.
Killing Gravity by Corey White.
The Black Tides of Heaven by J.Y. Yang.
And The Red Threads of Fortune, its companion novella, also by J.Y. Yang.
Yeah. All right, so we do have, after all those nominees, one pick for our top novella of the year.
We do.
Drum roll, please. And it is...
River of Teeth.
River of
Sarah
Teeth
Gailey.
by Sarah Gailey. And this is, I'm going to start out by saying the same thing you said for American War by Omar El-Akkad. This is a book that we picked up months and months and months ago before we'd even decided to do this best books, novels, TV shows, etc. of 2017. And the fact that it stuck with both of us and sort of, informed what we thought of as the best writing of 2017 just speaks very well of what Sarah Gailey managed to put together here. River of Teeth is such an accomplishment.
Amazing book. I mean, the premise could have derailed a lesser author. Yes. It's a great premise.
Yes.
But if you walk away from this book thinking that hippos on the bayou is all that there is to love about this book, you're wrong.
Yeah.
It is good on many, many different levels. And I really appreciated personally that there was, again, strong representation for the queer community, especially non-binary or agender characters.
Yeah.
And there was also, I mean, yeah, the premise was great, but the sentence work,
Yes.
the line by line putting together of this book, I mean, I probably couldn't sleep if I was Sarah Gailey and writing this book, because those lines were just, so many of them were seared into my memory. And Taste of Marrow, its sequel, is also a really strong novella.
Yes.
But when we talk about the winner, we picked the first book in the series, not just because it's convenient to pick the first book in a series, but also
Right.
because I do think it was perhaps the most complete of the books in this particular duology, in that it stood on its own two legs. It didn't necessitate a sequel in order to be a pleasurable, complete, powerful novella. And novellas are hard.
Yeah.
So when I think about the other novellas on our list, and we'll talk about some of them in just a minute, we were really looking for novellas that did have legs. They could run a long way by themselves without any accompaniment by other novellas in a series, so on and so forth.
Yes, agreed. And the other thing that another thing that I love about River of Teeth, and this is true of Taste of Marrow as well, is that essentially it feels like a big old fuck finger to all of those things and all of those people who say, well, if you're doing this sort of historical fiction or that sort of historical fantasy or whatever, like that gender roles have to be, in a place where there are two genders and men are subservient to women and gay people don't exist and like white people rule over everyone, and just the fact that that is not true in any way. And yes, this is an alternate history. It is clearly drawn from the first page of the author's note, which is, by the way, just amazing on its own. That's like the best author's note ever. It's essentially like, this is the promise of all kinds of fantasy, all kinds of speculative fiction, generally all kinds of alternate history. It is alternate. You can do whatever the fuck you want. And, it just so happens that Sarah Gailey manages to put it together in a really wonderful way, and she's just a fucking kick-ass writer.
And a gift to Twitter.
Yes, for sure. So the fact that we get this and get it so powerfully, and yet it stands for so many things beyond what's directly on the page, definitely informed how I thought about this and how I thought about what was really the best novella of the year and why it had to be this one.
Yes, it had to be this one. I mean, all of our other picks are fantastic, but both of us looked at River of Teeth and were like, there you are.
Yep.
You're our pick.
Yeah.
So I'm very, very happy with our top pick, but I do know that there are some other books, other novellas to talk about from 2017.
Yeah. Well, why don't you lead us off? I led us off last time, so you take the floor this time.
Why, thank you,
You're welcome.
I'm going to talk first about J.Y. Yang's duology, The Black Tides of Heaven and the Red Threads of Fortune. Like River of Teeth and Taste of Marrow, it was conceived from the outset as a duology. This is a duology that starts off who knows how many installations long series, but these two books can be read simultaneously and independently, and I happened to read them both on the same day, which was perfect. So this is a fantasy series, very little science fiction inflection to this fantasy. It is informed by the author's experience and background and all of those good things. It is also perhaps the most kick-ass representation of NB/non-binary/agender characters by a #own-voices author in that J.Y. Yang identifies as using alternate pronouns, which I really, really respected when I saw this in their author bio at the end of, I think it was Black Tides of Heaven that I first read. So, fantastic series, incredible backstory to this series coming together, and really, really great characterization and line work on the page. I really look forward to seeing what happens with the series. There were a couple things where I was like, as a non-binary person, that were not easy fits with my personal experience,
Yeah.
but I have the feeling that that's going to be true of any representation. There's just not much non-binary representation out there, so
Yeah.
it feels like the stakes are higher. But
Yeah.
fantastic books, very quick reads, and gorgeous cover art. Highly recommend that you at least look at the covers and pick up the books if you can. So that would be my number one talk about after our top pick. What about you?
Well, let me lead you into the pleasingly bleak world of M.T. Anderson's Landscape with Invisible Hand. Now, one of the things that you will have probably noticed by now is that we have lumped together YA and adult fiction and everything because that boundary has never been less clear. And I mentioned that with respect to this book because at my library, when I looked up this book again, trying to look for the cover artist, because we'll talk about that a little bit later, it's lumped in with YA, and I say that it shouldn't be. And when I say that it shouldn't be, there's sort of like a stigma that I see attached to YA, and there shouldn't be that either. And again, this is a conversation for another day, but I say that in part because it's really complicated emotionally. This is not, this stands level with, the complicated emotions of something like American War or Future Home of the Living God. So the fact that this is for, that it's, or that the publisher thinks that it's for teenagers is impressive to me and makes me wonder, if I was 13, 14,
was
15.
I that teenager?
Right, was I that teenager? Would I be into this? But anyway, I'm really tangenting off. The reason why I love this book so much, or some of the reasons I loved it, it's framed in a really, really interesting way. Landscape with Invisible Hand puts you immediately, or I think it's meant to put literally a picture in your mind. Someone has, painted a landscape and there's an invisible hand, sort of guiding things. It's one of those titles that kind of sticks out on its own to me anyway. And it is an alien invasion book, but it's a lazy alien invasion book. Aliens come in and essentially what they do is exacerbate the social problems that already exist. The rich become richer, the poor become poor. There are new classes of people who do things that the aliens appreciate, but no one can really tell what they are. The main character's family really struggles. The mother is maybe going to get a job eventually, but it's been a while. Hundreds of people compete for one job selling soup on the corner of the street. It's very much like a revisitation of the Great Depression. So it's almost historical fiction in that way, but it's through a science fictional lens. And the painting comes into it because the main character is a painter, and part of what he's trying to do is win this contest because the invading aliens, the Vuv, enjoy some human art, but they have very clear ideas of what human art is. So it's such an unexpected book. It's such a lovely book. It's such a terribly bleak book. You don't often get books where even when they have representation as their main focus, there's something objectively, I don't want to say wrong exactly, but the main character is ill or recurringly sick or suffers from something that works against them, physically against them.
Yeah.
And that's true of this book. The main character is sick the entire time. And it's awful, and it's because of the invasion. It's basically this is alien colonialism explored through the eyes of a young artist. Highly recommended, all of the novellas on our list. It's super short. None of these are over 200 pages, certainly. I don't think a lot of them are even over 150 pages. So any of these, great short reads.
They all pack a punch. Yes,
they do.
Absolutely.
And they do it in a very short space. So,
and they're all super ambitious.
Yes, they are.
One of the things I loved about Landscape with Invisible Hand that I also loved about my next talk about pick, which is Adrian Tchaikovsky's Ironclads, is that these books are taking on huge, complicated subjects like class. Yeah. And they're just going at it. Yep. And they're going at it in 150-ish pages. Yep. And they're coming up with some really interesting conclusions, or maybe not conclusions. They're all sort of thought experiments.
Yeah.
Ironclads is different from Landscape with Invisible Hand in that it is not really an invasion narrative, like an alien invasion narrative. It's more like Starship Troopers in that you have giant mechs, which only rich people can afford, and we have these great interminable battles, especially in Europe, where the mechs are the star fighters, but the battles go on forever because they economically, I guess, have to, because ... class. And so there are these mercenary groups that fight these wars, and that is their entire, like, reason for existing. These lower classes is to fight the wars for the rich people who can never really make up their mind which side they really want to be on. They're just on the side that's most beneficial to them right then. And there's a great discussion about the intersection of class and corporatocracy, if that's the right term, and how corporations are now your primary identity and your primary allegiance.
Yeah.
Although nations also still play a role. And that feels really timely as well. 2017 was a year in which we talked a lot about the places we work for defining our futures, especially with their the power that health insurance has over a lot of people. So I really highly recommend picking up this book, not just because ambitious premise and whatnot, and not just because we happen to rave about everything that Adrian Tchaikovsky writes, but also because it's a lot of fun. Giant mechs fighting each other, and there's a rescue narrative, and you've got a ragtag team of people with different fighting abilities and skills going in to rescue a rich crybaby, essentially, who lost a mech. And it's very Starship Troopers in that it adopts the language and the kind of tenor of a battlefield veteran. And it's fun in addition to being crazy and awesome.
Yes.
So, yes. Your next talk about pick.
All right, well, here's something completely different. It is Ellen Klage's Passing Strange, which, if you take a look at the cover for this book, look it up on Amazon, look it up at your library, if you're lucky enough to have a place that has it on the shelf, take a look at that. You will both understand everything you need to know about this book and literally nothing when you look at that cover, which is to say, this is one of those rare books where the cover is, so important. Not just attractive, not just, well-designed, but actually integral to understanding what's going on in the book itself. Which is to say, this is a really clever novella of historical fiction. Also set in San Francisco, like Sourdough. But there's just enough speculative stuff in there. Some of the characters are probably witches. At least it's a way, you talk a lot about MacGuffins, for example. There is a magical MacGuffin in there towards the end of the book that actually allows something to happen. But it's one of those moments where you see the power of speculative fiction kind of flexing its muscles. It could have worked another way. It didn't have to be that way. But it's the same way that, if we thought about American War could have worked if, we were looking at it from a more contemporary perspective. Or the power could have worked if we were just approaching gender and race dynamics and weren't throwing in the speculative edge. Yes, there's still some power there. The things they're talking about are real. But the framing of what's going on within speculative fiction allows so much more. And that is absolutely true of Passing Strange. So get it, love it, read it twice, because in the beginning it's not going to make any goddamn sense. It's going to be heartbreaking at the end. You're going to want to go back and look at what's going on, and you're going to want to look at the cover the entire time. And that is all I'm going to say there. I'm not going to spoil it. Check it out. Really, really powerful. In such a small package.
Distracting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super distracting to want to read a book and stare at its cover all at the same time.
Truth.
My final talk about novella for 2017 is actually the second in a series, and I happen to think it's the strongest so far, now that I've read the third, which came out in 2018. I am talking about Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire, which is the sequel to Every Heart a Doorway, and I mean, it's not really, yes, it's a sequel. I would say that the third book, which is Beneath the Sugar Sky, is less of a sequel than Down Among the Sticks and Bones. So they all operate differently. They all have different ties to the Wayfarer Children
I think that's
series.
right.
But I happen to think Down Among the Sticks and Bones is the strongest because, as we mentioned earlier, we're looking for novellas with legs, and this book does not require any other books in order to be a fantastic novella on its own. And when I read the first book in the series, Every Heart a Doorway, I had a couple of like things where I emerged and I was like, I really hope that the next book deals with X and Y. And Down Among the Sticks and Bones dealt with X and Y, and it didn't pose any of those questions at the end. I didn't have any of the struggles that I did with the first book in the series. And the first book in the series was great. So that means that Down Among the Sticks and Bones is even more great and totally worthy of you picking up and reading.
Yes.
It deals with Jack and Jill, which I just love. And they have this magical world to which they have ties, and to which they both want to return, but for different reasons, but they can't return for complicated reasons. It's heartbreaking, it's sweet, it talks a lot about sibling love and the complicated relationships between siblings where we both love and are endangered by our siblings, and it's so strong. Go read it. There's a lot of debate over this book in terms of its placement in libraries, again, because it kind of does some YA-ish things, and it also does some very adult things. I happen to think it's appropriate for teen readers, but it's also very sophisticated in its interrogation of everything. Identity, death, siblings, family. So good. So that's my final talk about pick. What's yours?
My final talk about is, or rather comes from, one of our very favorites. You've heard us talk about her many a time on this podcast before. It is Nnedi Okorafor and her novella, Binti Home, sequel to Binti, the second in a trilogy that was, at the time of recording, just completed. Binti, The Night Masquerade is out now. I have not read it yet. We have not, neither of us have read it yet. We will soon. But Binti Home deserves its spot on this list because of how compelling it is in accomplishing its goal of continuing this space operatic universe. We actually had, in addition to the emotional volume, the volume of space that, these works take up that you talked about earlier, there's just kind of also this capaciousness of content in some of the books. There's Corey White's Killing Gravity, but there's also Nnedi Okorafor's Binti Home, in which you get basically a whole space opera in 150 pages. Like, how does that work? That shouldn't work. And
it's
yet
magical.
It does. And, putting aside that both of the books that I just mentioned are in a series of novellas, even if you put together, 3 novellas, as Nnedi Okorafor has done in the Binti series, you're topping out at like 300 to 400 pages.
Right.
And you look at some of these other space operas that are many books long, and each individual book is like fucking 900 pages. Like,
right.
What I appreciate about all of the books on our list, but Binti Home in particular, is that it's so calculated about each word that's on the page, the order of those words on the page, the aesthetic of those words on the page, the picture that's painted via those words on the page. There's so much that Nnedi Okorafor has put into giving you exactly what she can give you, exactly what she wants to give you, and not anything more. It's clearly balanced, and it's balanced so well. It's just, and it's a joyful follow-up to what happened in Binti. Somehow we visit multiple planets, we're introduced to multiple cultures, multiple sects within the cultures, and it never seems rushed. It never seems like we don't have enough time to do it. It is a complete world, and it's a complete world in 150 pages. Again, so just, again, the accomplishment that is the ability to do that, and the ability to do it beautifully with some of the best writing is what Nnedi Okorafor has here, and why it was one of my best novellas of the year.
And the fact that it's pitched as Afrofuturism just makes me love it more.
Yes.
I happen to really, really love the taglines that Nnedi Okorafor has assigned to the trilogy on Twitter and elsewhere.
Oh, yes.
The original Binti and Binti Home and Binti the Night Masquerade roughly line up with these lines. Girl leaves home, girl comes home, and girl becomes home.
Yes.
Those lines are independently pretty evocative. In fact, I get a little emotional thinking about it just because I've read these books and I know what that means.
Yeah.
Well, I've read the first two, and I'm really looking forward to the final book in the series.
So much.
I will be purchasing these when I have money. I'm so excited.
Yeah.
But Binti was a strong contender. If we had done the Imaginary Awards in 2016, this would have been a strong contender then, and I think probably Binti the Night Masquerade will be a strong contender for novellas in 2018.
Agreed.
Everything Okorafor does is magical, but the Binti series has a very close place to my heart, and that Binti was the first book by Nnedi Okorafor that I read, and immediately I went and started devouring Nnedi Okorafor, and now I'm like so deep into many other authors who I love and enjoy, like N.K. Jemisin and like Octavia Butler, because I read Binti. So Binti changed the way that I read. It made me start reading novellas. I respect the hell, everything out of Nnedi Okorafor.
Yes.
So, there you have it. Those are our novellas.
All right, so the next award that we want to give out is for the Best Debut Novel or Novella of 2017. So this is an award for authors who may have been established because they'd written short stuff before, or they were completely new to everyone when they suddenly burst onto the scene with their first book. But for a book or a novel or a novella to qualify as a nominee in this category, it had to be an author's first published long-length work. So.
And that does include novellas. Some people might fight us on that. But when you look at the other categories on like the Hugo and whatnot, there are many shorter categories like novelette and fun things like that.
Yeah.
So we are looking at novels and novellas as substantial first works.
Yes. So let me start us off with our first nominee. Again, we're presenting these in alphabetical order by author's last name. We have The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden.
Then we have The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty.
Forest of a Thousand Lanterns by Julie C. Dow.
American War by Omar El Akkad, because we can't get enough of that.
Nope. Winter Tide by Ruthanna Emrys.
River of Teeth, again, because we can't get enough of Sarah Gailey.
The Stars Are Legion by Cameron Hurley.
Spaceman of Bohemia by Jaroslav Kolfar.
An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon.
And lastly, Killing Gravity by Corey White.
Awesome.
We were looking for a book which piqued our interest for a future body of work.
Yeah.
Like, this is an author who we've never heard from before, who we now believe, based on this debut novel, that we'll be seeing as a rising star and as someone who will stick around for the future that we will probably follow for a long time. So while these other authors are fantastic and we will check in with them frequently, we are particularly excited about who?
Ruthanna Emrys, based on her debut novel, Winter Tide.
So you introduced me to this book.
Yes, I found this, and I came to this in one of those weird weekends where I was flying a lot. We were going to a wedding, so I read this on and off at airports and in I almost said strange cities in San Francisco, which is not that strange a city. I mean, it is strange. It was not new, though.
It is. Yeah.
But what excited me about this is that, kind of like La Belle Sauvage, it was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. It was calling upon this corpus of Lovecraftian works. It was clearly occupying this particular mythos that had been established. And yet, it was in the same way that one of the novellas we've raved about time and again, Kij Johnson's The Dream Quest of Ellet Bow, kind of takes that universe and does new things with it. That's originally what drew me to Wintertide. But what marks Ruth Anna Emrys for me as a writer to watch is how deftly she moves through the different things that Wintertide does. It's not only, pulling on that Lovecraftian work, and in conversation with the other writers like Kij Johnson, who are also revisiting that work, as well as, Lovecraft from way back when and how all that got started, but it's also, pushing its way into the weird fiction space of, is that science fiction? Is it fantasy? Is it speculative at all? It's pushing its way into fantasy as a whole. It's pushing its way into literary fiction. It's pushing its way into so many different areas that I was most excited by this book to see where it takes us next. Like, where is Ruth Anna Emrys going to go? Is it going to be in this universe? Is it going to be a genre-defying work in a completely different universe? Is she going to make something up? But what this signaled to me is that not only do we have someone to watch, someone whose book I would buy immediately just based on her name, but also someone who's going to continue to reinvent and push things forward in really pleasurable ways. Yeah. And it is true of all of our nominees. It's true of all of the talkabouts we're going to do in just a few moments, but we both agreed that Wintertide, in particular, as kind of an avatar for what Ruth Anna Emrys can do, is our top pick for the year of, we're looking forward to what you can do next. This was an awesome debut.
We really are. Yeah. And I read Wintertide while stumbling around Glacier National Park on Christmas morning. So it was very timely for me. And it wasn't necessarily, it's hard for me to say this, but it did not catch me at the right moment. But the fact that it impressed me so much, even while it didn't catch me at the right moment, says a lot about how powerful Ruth Anna Emrys is as a writer.
Yeah.
So I am a huge fan of her as an author. I'm a huge fan of all of the ideas that she starts in Wintertide. And I'm pretty excited, too, to see what she breaks in the next novel.
Yeah.
So she likes breaking things. And it's going to be very, very exciting to see what comes from, her mind in the next couple of years.
Agreed.
So.
And that's such a good way to put it. And it's such a good descriptor of this category in general. We have a list of fantastic fucking breakers. Like, these folks broke things wide open, and I really want to see what the fuck they're gonna break next.
Right. And I would say one of my talkabouts, I'm not even really going to talk about that much because we've talked at length about it already. American War. Yeah. Omar Al-Akkad also breaks things. The logic of his world is different. Yeah. And I loved the heck, obviously, out of American War and highly recommend it. But I would like to transition straight to your first talkabout, which I did not have a chance to read. So I'm really excited to hear about your next talkabout.
Yeah. So basically everything we were just saying about novellas, how they're wonderful and, they accomplish so much in such in so few pages. You can have a novella that tackles the largest topics. You can have a novella that is a complete and self-contained space opera, so on and so forth. But on the other side of that, sometimes works just require many pages, hundreds of pages, in order to breathe, in order to establish the world, in order to say something about something.
Yeah.
And what most excited me, well, not most excited me, but one of the things that excited me most about the debuts this year is that we got City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. And I love this book because as much as, you know, we have movements like Own Voices, as much as we have entire genres and subgenres of science fiction, of fantasy, you know, of all kinds of speculative fiction that have seen recent installments that are really lovely and really not what we've seen before in terms of, you know, the genders and the sexes and the races and the ethnicities and the sexualities and the gender identities and more and more and more that are represented both by the characters in those works and by the authors themselves. High fantasy is something that has really struggled for a long time through now and will continue to struggle with being this province of like really straight white men. And occasionally you'll get works that kind of interrupt that. We've talked briefly before about Kirith Kieran, which is one of those books that's held up by folks who are interested in queer fantasy as kind of like this is high fantasy done queerly. This is how you do high fantasy with queer characters. But you'll notice that we don't really have anything since then. We haven't had a whole lot. There are works that are starting to, you know, push at that. But I say all of this to recognize that S.A. Chakraborty has given us the first novel in a series that does all that and more. That not only, you know, sort of like swaps out the typical, you know, Lord of the Rings-ish Western white man fantasy with like, you know, a woman of color as the main character, but entirely reinvents what epic fantasy is, what high fantasy is, what it's based on, the myths that it's based on, how in English we can have high fantasies that aren't based on like Northern Europeans. And she does such a good job with it. Like, I'm so excited to read the next book. And see what happens here. And thankfully, we don't have to wait too long. The next book in this series comes out at the end of 2018. I think it's November, but I don't want to necessarily be quoted on that.
Yeah.
The fact that, you know, it was broken so successfully, and what I've seen so far, a lot of the comparisons that this book is getting is to Patrick Rothfuss's ongoing series that starts with The Name of the Wind, which, again, both of us really love, but also say, you know, there are problems with this. Again, you know, about a white male character who is straight, who, like, you know, is chasing the girl, and it's difficult to reduce it to that girl? Because, well, multiple girls, because, you know, there's so much going on there, but at the same time, it's treading a really well-known path.
Yeah.
And City of Brass is not. City of Brass is epic in its scope, high in its ambition, fantastic in the way that it puts all of it together. But you probably haven't read something like it before. I certainly had not. And I hope that, you know, if you have read something like it before, you will tell me what it is so that I may also read it. But if you haven't, and high fantasy is your thing, epic fantasy is your thing, check this the fuck out.
Yeah. And there's, again, no graceful transition to my next talk about, except to say that Cameron Hurley in The Stars Are Legion does a lot of things I could never have predicted for science fiction. So not fantasy at all, except also utterly fantastical in its approach to science fiction. Mm-hmm. It's the weirdest book I have read this year. I felt deeply uncomfortable because a lot of it has to do with squishy flesh-like planets that like have beating hearts and weird things like that.
Yes.
And like it's very eggy and yolky and like things like it's very textured. It relies heavily on texture, which is not my thing. Like I'm getting shudders thinking about texture, which is super funny. But it's one of the most evocative books on our list in that it makes you feel things as you're reading.
Yeah.
You're not simply a witness to the page. You are actually inhabiting this very, very strange universe. It does ask a very important thing of you at the outset. It does ask that readers suspend the disbelief over fleshy, beating heart planets, and also that there are literally no men in
Yes.
this universe,
Yes.
and it's not even a question thing. It is just the assumption that there are no men.
Yeah.
There never have been men. There's no way for there to be men. And a lot of readers might struggle with that approach, but because there isn't this question of men having once been there and now not being there,
Right.
there isn't this, like, attention over, like, X power structures,
Yes.
which are very pleasurably explored in other books like The Power. So
Yeah.
it's just taking a very different approach to science fiction.
Yes.
It's some ways so deeply problematic in, like, the best possible ways. And in some ways it is just like a simple, straightforward, like, action narrative that happens to be set in weird, squishy, fleshy planets with beating hearts. And really weird technologies that make zero sense but also make perfect sense in context. So
Yeah.
it's a book where you check your shudder reflex and you also check your expectations of science fiction at the door.
Yeah.
And that door happens to be squishy and have a beating heart. And it's like,
Yep.
I can't get over it. It's so weird.
Yes.
But it's also great because it's like nothing else on our list. In its language, it operates differently. In its characterization, it operates differently. It's super queer, but it's also not queer at all because there isn't a binary.
Right.
It's so different. I highly recommend you check
Yeah.
it out. It made the list because it's very clever in
Yes.
addition to being very weird. And I cannot recommend it enough. So
Yes.
go out there and check it out, but also be aware that you will feel super gross
Absolutely.
sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
your next talk about.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but River of Teeth is fucking genius. And it's listed here because it's, we couldn't have, as with American War, a list of our favorite debuts without listing what we thought was the best develop of the year. So we
Right.
couldn't, but, I mean, really, again, as with The City of Brass, as with American War, these debuts are such that, as a reader, if I see Sarah Gailey's name on something in the future, I will pick it up without hesitation.
I'll
It
pick
is-
that the fuck up.
Yes,
Yeah.
it has made me a devotee. But, again, just the cool ways it takes us forward in terms of alternate history, in terms of speculative fiction in general, the grand old finger that it gives to, well, if you're doing this thing, then it has to be, like, historically accurate, except that it's not. Like, forget that. Forget
Yes.
all that. Everything
Yes.
that Sarah Gailey
Yes.
does, it allows her to do much more. It allows us to do much more. It allows the field as a whole to move forward. It allows us to read new things. Can't get enough of it. Can't praise it enough. If you have not read River of Teeth, check it out.
Check it the fuck. It's so good. Man, it's really good. And we
Yeah.
are going to do, at some point over this next year, we're going to do a podcast about alternate histories.
Yes.
There are some really great ones out there.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to unpack in its premise and in its execution of that premise that's really pleasurable. So
Yeah.
my final talk about for this category is one that we've done a whole podcast about. So again, not going to spend too much time talking about today. But it's Jaroslav Kalfar's The Spaceman of Bohemia, which we talked about on, I believe, episode 31 of our podcast. And, oh man, this was a recommendation to us that has continued to surprise us in really great ways.
Yeah.
And I really, really can't wait to see what Jaroslav Kalfar does next, because he could either go in a very literary direction or a very, very sci-fi direction,
Yeah.
or both, or something else entirely. It's a super weird book. It's a little bit more traditionally weird than Cameron Hurley's The Stars Are Legion,
Yeah,
but
for sure.
very, 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 very fun and strange, and opens up some very interesting questions about the nature of memory and the nature of consciousness that I think we would be remiss not to comment upon.
Yes.
So yes, that would be my final talk about. Check out The Spaceman of Bohemia. I think it probably would make a great audiobook if you
Yeah.
have access to an audiobook version.
Agreed.
So.
Yeah.
All right, your final talk
And my
about.
final talk about, I'm actually, so again, we have our, our cheat sheet here, and based on a book that I'm currently reading, I'm going to change up my final talk about and say that the final book I want to talk about for best debut of 2017 is An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. And the reason why I want to change it to that is that, again, it does such new things in such old territory. This book is essentially, I forget exactly what the jacket says. I wish I had brought it in with me. I actually have it out from the library right now. But something about reinventing and reinvestigating the social norms and the social roles of the antebellum South on a giant spaceship, which is just fucking bizarre, first of all, but it's carried out so well. River Solomon is a person of color, so you have own voices there. Specifically, a person of color who is non-binary. So just, the sort of River Solomon view we get of River Solomon's world in this book is so lovely and so welcome that I couldn't, in good conscience, not recommend this book, because it's something that I only came to actually in December. I learned that it existed because some kind and wonderful soul on our Goodreads poll suggested it as a book that we might want to pick up. I have no idea who that person was. I don't think it was one of us. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. Unless you're going to tell me right now that it was you. No. It was someone we don't know. But the fact that it managed to get in there and that I'm now aware of it, I really, I want to pass it on and say, without saying too much about it, because I honestly haven't finished it yet. It's the last book of 2017 that I wanted to read, and so appropriately, it's something I want to talk about on this podcast. As with all the other books on this list, it breaks things. And it breaks them really pleasurably. But it breaks them in a way that immediately tells you what the book is, but also who River Solomon is as that book's writer. And makes me want to pick up more. And makes me want to know more about how that particular writer works, much as how I want to know more about how Sarah Gailey works, how Omar El-Akkad works, how Catherine Arden works, how all the people on our nominees list work. But this receives and deserves that special shout out because of how it sucked me in and made me want more, not only from that book, but from all the future books.
Right. Oh, man. And, okay, so that is our final talk about for this particular category. I'm really excited also about our next category, in part because we have done many podcasts that relate to these particular authors and their works. The category is Best Series Entry, so it can't be number one in a new series. It has to be number 2 or further down the series. And we had some fantastic series that either reached a middle or a conclusion in 2017.
Yeah. We have our 2017 nominees for Best Novel or Novella Entry in an ongoing series. So, I'll start us off with The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden.
Daughter of Eden by Chris Beckett.
Taste of Marrow by Sarah Gailey.
The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin.
Luna, Wolf Moon by Ian MacDonald.
Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shannon Maguire.
Akana Warrior by Nnedi Okorafor.
Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor.
And After the Flare by Deji Bryce Olokutan. And I haven't said his name out before, so I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I think you're close.
Cool.
So, talk to us a little bit about that.
And our top pick, we have chosen one for this award, and it goes to Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shannon Maguire.
Which obviously we have talked about at length on this podcast already, so we won't belabor the point too much, but we did think it deserved a number one pick on our list, and it won Best Series Entry because, as we talked about earlier, it has serious legs. So go out there, find yourself a copy of Down Among the Sticks and Bones. Please also find the prequel and the third book in the series, which are also out, but know that in our opinion, this is just a really, really stellar novella and our top pick for this category. Did you have any thoughts that we hadn't covered in previous discussion.
You covered a lot of what I wanted to say. I obviously need to give, or add my props to yours, to Seanan McGuire, for being just an amazing writer, period. But also the fact that this book works. It's easy to sort of say that, the books in this category are part of a series that's going to be 3 books or 5 books or, X number of books. We don't know. In each of them, we're sort of drawing on this knowledge that we already have when we go into the next book. We know who the characters are, we know where the plot is, we know what the arcs are, and they're continuing in a way that makes it really pleasurable to interact with them in a different way. But what I like so much about Down Among the Sticks and Bones, and why it stood out to me among our many other very worthwhile nominees, is that it's something that you can both appreciate very much so, having read other books in the Wayward Children series. Granted, there was only one other at the time that we're recording this, although Beneath the Sugar Sky just came out. But also you could appreciate it on its own. And for some reason, for me, that the ability of this book to both really pleasurably tie back to characters we already know, that we got to know very well in the first book, and yet also, be a really powerful work on its own, really said, this is the best way that you can do a series entry. It's both serialized and non-serialized, kind of in a way. And I don't mean to put that above other books that are, doing really, really fantastic things with characters that are established and series that are established. And it sort of sounds like I am doing that. And I don't want to give you that idea because it's, it definitely is relying on what's gone before. But that it was so multifaceted, in addition to all the praise that we've already heaped upon it, really pushed it over the top for me.
Right. And unlike many of our other picks for this category, we have not spent a great deal of time talking about Seanan McGuire on our podcast, but we will remedy that in the future because I do believe we have an item on our list for the vague future, which talks about children in science fiction and fantasy, and especially groups of children doing groups of children-y things in science fiction and fantasy. So Down Among the Sticks and Bones and the rest of its series is a fantastic example of a magical school, essentially. And it has a fresh take on it. This is not a reboot of Harry Potter by any shape.
No.
So, yes, fantastic book. Can't wait for y'all to read it.
Yes.
And we have some really great talk-abouts as well.
We do, yes. So why don't I start us off with Catherine Arden's The Girl in the Tower, which almost, I thought, maybe didn't quite count as a technicality because both this book and the first book in its series, The Bear and the Nightingale, came out in 2017. The Bear and the Nightingale back in January of 2017, and The Girl in the Tower either in November or December. I don't remember when. I ordered it from the library, but it took a while to arrive. So very late in the year, no matter what. But direct sequel picks up more or less where The Bear and the Nightingale left off. And again, in the same kind of way that books like City of Brass and Unkindness of Ghost, etc., really break things. What Catherine Arden does in these books is take you back to Russia. And I mean, very Siberian Russia, when Moscow and the characters do visit Moscow. Is, kind of a collection of palaces, but they're not very good palaces, and people still live in the mud, and, a lot of it is forested, it's under snow and ice for a lot of the year, and spirits still live, and very mundane spirits that can be helpful and be placated with a drink of water, or a crust of bread, or some blood, and in which the characters, our title character in particular, is facing this schism between the old ways, in which the spirits are very much real, and the coming of Christianity, in which the Christian priests are saying, no, these things aren't real. Anyone who sees them or attends to them is a witch and, needs to be exorcised, needs to right, exactly. So again, looking at very, very real things that happened in history, but through this speculative lens of well, what if? And, you know, kind of in the same way that a book like Hild by Nicola Griffith, you know, took something that is historical, St. Hilda, and sort of said, well, our view of what's fantasy and what's fantastical wasn't really their view of what's fantastical. Which isn't to say that if you somehow had time travel and you went back to the 13th century or whatever, you wouldn't find like actual spirit creatures out there, like from a Miyazaki movie. I'm just going to mix literally all of my Northern Hemisphere together right now.
Crazy.
But, you know, and that's not what Catherine Arden is doing in this book either, but it's sort of like this, well, way back when there weren't as many people, when everything was much more wild, what was the consequence of that wilderness?
Sure.
Like, what else was living out in that wilderness before civilization in whatever guise? And, you know, it's presented partially via Christianity. In the second book, you get more, like, politicking. You get more, cultures kind of clashing with each other very subtly, but it's definitely a major theme of the book. What price is that? And she explores that in these books. And The Girl in the Tower is just a fantastic follow-up to a beautiful debut. Would highly recommend both of them. And another one, I'm sure, coming out not too soon because we're not done with this world just yet.
My first talk about is going to feel very familiar to some of you guys who've listened to our podcast before, because I am here to talk about The Stone Sky, the third and final installation of N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth series. And I know that there were some readers out there who did not think this was the strongest installment in her series, but I happen to think it's pretty incredible. In part because when you read the author note at the end, you realize that this book is not just a fantastic, stands on its own legs work of science fiction that's informed by fantasy, but it's also a very raw working through of N.K. Jemison's grief over the passing of her mother. Mm-hmm. And the fact that she was able to write this book at all, the fact that she was able to write this book about a mother and daughter's relationship after a cataclysm is incredible. The fact that she wrote it well is even more, really, it's a gift. It's a real gift to those of us who love N.K. Jemisin. I think it ends the series in a very satisfying way. And I also think that it introduces us to a richly rounded character, which in previous installments had not been so richly rounded. So it develops the work of the earlier books in a really pleasurable, insightful, and engaging way. And the lines are really strong. I mean, N.K. Jemisin has a way with words. We talked about her series, especially the earlier books in the series, at length in episode 19 of our podcast. Yeah. So I highly recommend you go back and listen to that, because that will talk a lot more about why we love the world that she built, and that it still plays a very important role in why I love The Stone Sky. So check out the podcast, read The Stone Sky, grieve and weep and cry with me, because it was so damn good. What's your next talk about?
So my next talk about, as long as we're going back into our archive, you might as well take a look back to episode 11, in which we talked about Chris Beckett's Dark Eden. Dark Eden was then followed by a sequel, Mother of Eden, and now it's a trilogy. Daughter of Eden is the third in the series, and I will be honest with you, after Mother of Eden, I was kind of done with it. Like, Dark Eden had some really interesting ideas. Mother of Eden moved some of them forward, but also was
kind of sexist.
Had a lot of problems, and made some. Well, we can talk about.
We've talked about that.
That one.
That is a different thing.
I sort of put out there that I was done with the series and I didn't like Mother of Eden that much, to say how much of an improvement Daughter of Eden is. It delivers entirely upon all of the premises and the promises of the first two books. And it does so in what almost looks like an effortless way. And it's really just, knowing what it took to get there that makes it really work. Having had the background I think it's awesome. Like, we know more about it, but you could also just pick up this book and probably, just run with it, understand what's going on. And what makes it work so well is that it really figures out its juxtaposition and its own social experiment. Like, how do you really think about, a new colony of people on an alien world who didn't mean to be there, and, overlooking the biological limitations. They're all, like, horribly inbred because they came from, two people,
like
which
two people,
actually characters in this book call out and say, like, how the fuck does this work? Which is, very good. Essentially, we get everything that was missing from the first two books in a really, really pleasurable revisitation to Eden and what is happening there. The dark rogue planet that is, this supposedly uninhabitable world on which we have this unintended fracture colony of people. So whether or not you have read the other books in this series, Daughter of Eden is a treat on its own. I would say, honestly, if you haven't read the other two, pick this one up first. If you had read the other two, definitely pick this one up.
My next talk about is one that came out relatively early in 2017, and we both enjoyed a great deal. We both really enjoyed this book. And I think we even thought it was an improvement over the first book in the series, which we also really enjoyed. And we really, in depth, explored in episode 4 of our podcast, going way far back. I think this might have been the first episode with good audio.
It was, yeah.
Like, really far back in our archives. Don't listen to anything before this episode necessarily, but listen to the episode about Ian McDonald's Luna New Moon, which is the prequel to the book that I am going to talk about right now, which is Luna Wolf Moon. So this book picks up right after the events of Luna New Moon, in which basically you had a carefully constructed hierarchy that was just blown to bits, literally and figuratively. And now we have to explore the aftermath of this explosion, cataclysm on the moon. And we're looking at it socially and, I guess, physically, literally, in terms of we're looking at, you have people literally examining wreckage, and you also have people navigating ever more complex relationships because of what happened in the first book. It's a briefer book than Luna New Moon. It's slimmer. It packs a punch. I think its sentences go places that the first book doesn't. It's concise. It's incisive. It's really, really well constructed. The only reason why it's not higher on the list is that it came out earlier in the year, and a lot happened after it came out earlier in the year, and a lot of other books kind of crowded in. So, fantastic book. Highly recommend. Can't wait for the next book in the series. It does necessitate a sequel, and I very much look forward to that book. So check out Luna Wolf Moon by Ian McDonald. Also has a really, really gorgeous cover. What is your final talk about for this category?
So again, this is a book that we've already mentioned in the awards. It is Binti Home by Nadia Korafor. And the reason why I want to mention this again is not only is it an awesome standalone novella, which we already said, but it really delivers on the promise of the first book. And it does that by expanding its character's interior and the world's exterior. We get such a contained little novella in Binti. Basically, you have the title character, Binti, leaving home, boarding a spaceship. A lot of the novella takes place on that spaceship or on another spaceship that's nearby to the first one, and then we end on another world. But again, really contained, really tense. It's paced very well. It's, all things considered, deliciously wonderful novella. But what Binti Home does, and again, it's amazing that this can happen inside of a novella's length, but it opens up the world so much. We not only see where Binti is now, we get the journey back to her home, we get, a full understanding of what that home is like, the people who inhabit her home, her family, her culture, her society, and Binti herself. And I say that her interior expands because we get to know so much more about who Binti is in these different spaces with these different people in in a way that we didn't because she was so removed in the first book. And again, I really love the sentences that you quoted that are Nnedi Okorafor's descriptions of these books. And if Binti is about the girl, Binti, leaving home, then Binti home is absolutely about coming home, both in terms of the physical movement of going back to the place where she is from, like that actual location on a map, the physical space, but also about that interior journey. Like, what does it mean to go home after experiencing the things that she's experienced?
Agreed.
And that we have that, that entry in this series, in the Binti series, after the frankly horrific events of the first novella, just speaks to Nnedi Okorafor's power as a writer. So, really, really deserving entry on this list, and just a fucking kick-ass novella.
Right. And very deeply tied to my final talk about, in part because I think that the thing I love most about Binti Home in that we get to see our world in the future and a part of our world that, let's just say it, white Western science fiction authors have traditionally ignored. We get to see the persistence of all of these wonderful cultures which do exist in today's world. And will persist in the future.
Yeah.
And it's rich, and not just in imagination, because these places and these peoples actually exist, except for the alien ones.
Right.
So far that we know.
Maybe.
But like, we're getting to see an inhabited future with peoples who really need to be like recognized and honored for their amazingness. So Binti Home does that. And also, my final talk about is another Nnedi Okorafor. It is Akata Warrior, which is the sequel to Akata Witch. Now, categorically, this might be technically a separate category. I know Nnedi has some short, brief descriptors of all of her series and what they're doing. And Akata Warrior is doing something else. It's a little bit more young adult. It skews a little bit younger. It's a little bit more like Harry Potter reading level, I guess. It also has a Harry Potterish element in that you have young characters coming to terms with and learning how to use their powers. But what's most engaging and amazing about Akata Warrior and Akata Witch, the whole series, is that it places this within, again, another context that does exist in our world, Nigeria, and that will persist in the future, but hasn't traditionally been written into white Western science fiction. So, fantastic world. I'm very, very grateful to Nnedi for doing the incredible work that she does. I also think that as a sequel and as a book, Akata Warrior is very strongly written. I think that the characters are rich and rounded and have complex interior journeys. And that Akata Warrior delivers on the promise of Akata Witch, and that it also sets the stage for a satisfying next book in the series. So as a sequel, it does and checks all the boxes that we love. And it's I highly recommend that you go out and check it out. And not that you tie it to the legacy of Harry Potter. I probably did it a disservice by mentioning that other series. It has its own world, its own internal rules, and its own matters of appeal. And I don't think that it suffers by any comparison to any other series out there. I think that it has like its own story to tell, and it does a fantastic job of doing that.
Yes,
so
agreed.
Highly recommend all of the picks on our talkabouts.
Yep.
Now, Tony.
Yes.
I'm a bit of a comics nerd.
Oh. Oh.
You hadn't noticed.
Sorry, that was like the wrong oh.
So we're gonna blaze through the next two categories because you have only read like one or two of the items on the list. So
I just feel like you're doing all the heavy lifting here, and I appreciate it. I'm not a really good comics reader.
That's okay. I am big into comics, so I am going to give you some personal recommendations for the best comics of 2017. These have not truly been informed by Tony's opinions, so they are not like many of our other categories, but there will be some categories coming up in our next podcast when we cover the second half of the Imaginary Awards, where Tony will get to take the lead and do most of the talking. So
Yay.
you will have your chance. I'm going to go ahead and read off my candidates for best comics. I have two categories. One is volume in an ongoing series, so it can't be number one, kind of like our, series category for regular books. And then the second category is the first volume or a standalone graphic novel. So those are books which, I lump those together because a lot of graphic novels end up having sequels too. So here we go.
Let's do it.
For volume in an ongoing series, my candidates were Kurt Busiek's Autumnlands Volume 2, which was Woodland Creatures. Then Bitch Planet Volume 2, which is also titled President Bitch by Kelly Sue DeConnick. Then the Bitch Planet Triple Feature Volume 1, also by Kelly Sue DeConnick. And of course, all of these are by author's last name, and we haven't read off the lists of all of the illustrators and letters and colorists involved, but I highly recommend you check out those fantastic people as well. Next, we have The Wicked and the Divine, Volume 5, Imperial Phase 1 by Kieran Gillen. We have Wonder Woman Volume 2, Year 1 by Greg Rucka. We have Paper Girls Volume 3 by Brian K. Vaughan, and Saga Volume 7 by Brian K. Vaughan. And then the last candidate for Best Volume in an Ongoing Series was Rat Queen's Volume 4, High Fantasies by Curtis Weeb, I believe is his name. And my top pick for 2017 as a volume in an ongoing series is Bitch Planet Volume 2 by Kelly Sue DeConnick. If you have not kept up with this series, I highly recommend that you check out Bitch Planet, both its triple features and its regular main arc. Many people have noted that it has thematic ties and really kind of expands upon some of the central questions of books like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, also Naomi Alderman's The Power, these strong feminist texts in which we're examining a future in which women have been sidelined or oppressed, and as a natural consequence of persistent evils in the world today, like in 2017. So Bitch Planet Volume 2 is timely. It reflects today just as much as it speculates about tomorrow, and the art is incredible. Kelly Sue DeConnick's writing is also great. Highly recommend it. My other top 3 picks for volumes in an ongoing series, I'm just going to blaze through these, are Saga Volume 7. Brian K. Vaughan is pretty much always a safe pick, and Saga is his best current series, I think, even though I also love Paper Girls. And then Wonder Woman Volume 2, Year 1 is a fantastic entry into the superhero canon. It's also very, very gay, and I loved that about it. It is so, so gay, and I just... Everything about this particular volume was great. I was not particularly impressed by Volume 1 in this particular arc, but Volume 2 is awesome. And then Autumnlands, Volume 2 by Kurt Busiek. The reason why I put this on the list is that sometimes you just find transcendently good comic art. And that is what Volume 2 of Autumnlands, I mean, all of Autumnlands is great, but this particular volume, just really spectacular art. I love the world and the way in which the artists and the writers and the colorists have all come together to realize that vision. So good. So those are my best picks for volumes in an ongoing series. My candidates for the first volume in a new comic series or a standalone graphic novel are Afar by Leila Del Duca, Kindred, a graphic novel adaptation by Damian Duffy, and of course it's an adaptation of Kindred by Octavia Butler, who's one of our favorites. My favorite thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris, Arclight by Brandon Graham, The Black Monday Murders Volume 1 by Jonathan Hickman, Black Hammer Volume 1 by Jeff Lemire, Above the Timberline by Gregory Manchess, The Witch Boy by Molly Ostertag, Slam Volume 1 by Pamela Ribon, Shattered Warrior by Sharon Shin, and Spill Zone Volume 1 by Scott Westerfeld. Some of these writers are pretty well known for other things, like Scott Westerfeld and his Uglies, Pretties special series. That's, pretty much where he cut his teeth. And that is a regular YA series, not a comic or graphic novel. But some of these are artists and comic writers who've been pretty specific in writing and publishing only comics. And Leila Del Duca is one of those. I follow her work religiously, and she has a new comic series coming out that hasn't been collected into any volumes yet called Sleepless, which I highly recommend. But my top pick, predictably, is Afar by Leila Del Duca. This is a standalone graphic novel. There might end up being more that follow it, but it has legs of its own. It doesn't necessitate or require a sequel. It features characters of color. It features fantastic, gorgeous art. It features a really interesting storyline that also taps into some of the reasons why we loved Aladdin and these other Middle Eastern inflected fantasy works when we were kids, but it does them right and it does it justice. So I highly recommend picking up Afar. I passed it out to a couple people at the library over the last year, and every single person has loved it. And that's not a normal experience with comic books or graphic novels. Usually there's always going to be at least a couple people who disliked it. This is not one of those books. Afar has been universally well liked by everyone I have recommended it to. So that is my top pick. My other talkabouts are Above the Timberline by Gregory Manchess, Arclight, and Slam. And Gregory Manchess, who put together Above the Timberline, this is I put it in graphic novel, but it is so many things. It is a book, like a coffee table sized book, hardback, in which Manchess has managed to paint like 200 or 240 oil paintings that are consistent in tone and tenor and tell a narrative, and then he wrote a story to go with it. Now, Gregory Manchess also illustrated one of our favorite book covers for the year, and we'll talk about that in our next podcast. But suffice it to say, he creates incredible standalone oil paintings, and putting 240 of them together in a book that's coffee table sized is like a terrifying prospect for any artist. I mean, because you have to have consistent style, consistent lighting, consistent brush strokes in order for it to feel like a cohesive whole. And he manages to do it, and it's incredible. It also costs a very pretty penny, so pick up at your local library if you don't have, $40 lying around. But if you do, I put my bucks towards this book because I want to see more really daring works of science fiction and fantasy that really break how we do the form and publication of fantasy and science fiction, just as much as it breaks like the storylines and plotting and characterization. So incredible book, and highly recommend at least bearing witness to it because it is pretty intense. Arclight by Brendan Graham. I believe there was also, I believe this was a husband-wife partnership. Arclight is super queer. It's super gorgeous. And it's super depressing that it's only a couple of volumes in this series. So it was always envisioned as like an arc within a larger storyline. So there's other volumes that are going to come out with independent story arcs and illustrators and whatnot after Arclight has finished its like couple of volumes. So look for the next volume. It's a short-lived thing, but it's a really bright light in the comic universe. It's really, 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 really amazing. And Slam, well, it's just a lot of fun, and it's got great art, and it features roller derby. So it's pretty grand. So check out those comics. And Tony, you did have a couple of texts that you picked up this year. Did you want to talk about any of them?
Yeah, really, really briefly. So the only new comic that I read this year is, I guess it's a graphic novel actually, but it's Molly Ostertag's The Witch Boy, which I honestly have not a lot to compare it to. It was wonderful standalone. It tackled, again, in a really interesting speculative fiction way, what it means to be a trans teen and what it means in general to have a really close-knit community and yet be ostracized from that community, or to feel like, even though you've been raised in that community, not to feel like you're a part of it. So really, really worth exploring in that way. Also, the graphic novel adaptation of Kindred, if you like Octavia Butler, if Kindred is a book that you have read, check this out. It is an incredibly faithful adaptation. It basically puts in a visual style that really complements and captures what Octavia Butler was trying to do, I think, very well. The story, like, it isn't, it's not changing a lot up. It's basically, here is Kindred in graphic novel form. Definitely worth taking a look at, whether or not you are familiar with Kindred not in graphic novel form. And that is it. That is those are all the graphic novels that I have read this year.
Well, they're great picks, though. I mean, they're fantastic picks, because Witchboy, the artist of Witchboy, Molly Ostertag, is actually also the artist on Shattered Warrior by Sharon Shim, which was another one of my, nominees for best first comic in a series or graphic novel. So really, really great art in Witchboy, in addition to a really fantastic story, and really sweet and age appropriate. I ran Witchboy by a couple of other librarians, and they all agreed that it's the kind of book which broaches truly difficult issues in a way that has so much heart. There's literally nothing about Witchboy that gives me pause. It's really, really a great book.
Yes.
Kindred, the graphic novel adaptation, if you are triggered by, like, violence against people of color or sexual assault, Kindred is, just trigger warning there. It is an incredibly faithful adaptation, and those of you who have read the original novel by Octavia Butler will understand that there's going to be some triggering material in this graphic novel. That said, it is powerful. And I also loved that it had a really beautiful introductory essay by none other than
Nydia Okorafor.
Yes. We love. Yes. And I can't think of a better way to end the first half of the Imaginary Awards than with another mention of Nydia Okorafor, just because we literally have talked about her in almost every podcast we've ever made. We still haven't given her own podcast.
No.
It'll happen. We will. So, Tony, what's left?
Oh, my gosh.
We talked about a lot.
Tune in next time. We have more awards to give out. If you are a watcher, we have television coming up. We have awards for Best Show of the Year, for Best Episode of a Show. We have an award for Best Movie. And in an award that we have made up, as though we aren't making up the rest of these, we have an award for Best Moment on Screen. So whether it's a TV show or a movie, what are the moments that seriously left us gasping last year? And finally, if you're not done looking at things yet, we have an award for the best cover art on a novel or novella for 2017.
Yes. We thought we'd bring it full circle back to books, but in visual form. So our next podcast is going to be excluding comics, all of the visuals of 2017. Yes. And I am super excited to talk about all of those categories and to hear your thoughts on some of the categories where I did not cover as much ground as you. So tune in next week for that. Tony, where can you find out more about the Imaginary Awards and about us?
So please check us out on our website at imaginaries.net. We are updated. Probably that will continue to be true up through when this episode goes up. But all of our back episodes are online. You can find a new page all about the Imaginary Awards. You can click from our website to all of the other places you can find us. On Twitter at imaginary_pod, on SoundCloud and on iTunes, in both places as the Imaginaries, and then on YouTube as well, where all of our back episodes are available.
Yeah, I mean, okay, we're 2 hours in. This has been, like, the first half of the Imaginary Awards is already, like, twice as long as our longest podcast.
True.
We are so grateful that you guys have stuck with us through this point. You've probably heard us stumble over our words a couple of times because, oh my goodness, there's a lot of ground to cover. And 2017 was such fertile ground for science fiction and fantasy. And we could talk about any of the books on our podcast at length for years and years, and we probably will. But as we move into 2018, Tony, give us a quick rundown of the first science fiction or fantasy book that you are going to read that has been published with a 2018 date.
Well, I'm really looking forward to both Beneath the Sugar Sky by Shannon McGuire and Binti the Night Masquerade by Nnedi Okorafor, both of which are the third entries in their respective series, and both of which are coming into the library any day now. But I have a full list of books on hold at the library that are currently either on order or in processing. That is the joy of requesting books early. We only started reading 2017 books really seriously like in August of September of last year, so we're getting into it.
We are.
We're going to see what 2018 has.
And as Tony intimated, we do actually have a spreadsheet that we are keeping this year of 2018 releases and the ones that we are ordering and reading. So we are going to make that list public at some point. You can look for more information on that on our website and on Twitter in the upcoming weeks. So if you're excited about 2018 the way we are, then you are probably also going to be daunted by this spreadsheet, which has hundreds of items. It's going to be so much fun. So thank you again for listening to today's podcast. Look for a part 2 here in the coming days.
See you next time, or you'll hear us next time.
It will be heard.